from all faiths who are committed to work together to combat and marginalize extremists who have held the world hostage with a bigotry and bias. He said, we must, he says, I repeat, we must urgently reclaim the center of the moral high ground that has been usurped from us. We must choose moderation over extremism. We must choose negotiation over confrontation. We must choose to work together and not against each other. And we must give this effort utmost priority, for time is not on our side. Without taking much of your time, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Christopher Boye. Christopher Boye is a well-traveled brother. He's an agronomist and also a horticulturalist. And there's some great things happening there with regard to the microbes that people are working on. That's the future today for going what they call non-chemical agriculture. And that's the way the world is moving right now. And I have some experience on that. Inshallah, I'll speak to Christopher when we have in our breaks. He's also a philosopher. He studied in France. He traveled to Zambia. He spent months in Swahili at some of the parish there. And also he spent 6 years in Khartoum, where he learned Arabic. He's got a master's degree in peace and justice from the Middlesex University. And also he traveled to Malawi. And he's been in South Africa until 2017, I think. And also he speaks on interfaith relations. Without taking much of your time, I'd like to call upon Christopher Boye to address us.
Thank you for this introduction. I came in South Africa in 2014, and I've been used to very different cultural contexts. In France, you know, Islam is seen as a problem, and when I was in Sudan, still worse. Thanks be to God. I was in Malawi also for 8 years, where relations are rather good. So when I arrived in South Africa, I was delighted to see that relations actually are excellent. Muslims, Christians in South Africa go along very well. And so I think we are in a blessed land, and we should really receive that gift of God to this land. I was privileged to be invited to be part of a committee for the Catholic bishops of this country on interfaith and ecumenical reflection and action. And so I was delighted to meet some Muslim groups which are quite open. I make an allusion to the Turquoise Harmony Institute in Johannesburg, which organized some meetings of interfaith. I'm regularly invited, so I try to respond to their invitations, and usually it's quite interesting. And of course, this group here at Rasooli Center, which is excellent, especially in the field of mysticism and spirituality. So for me, it's a privilege to be here today, and I had the privilege also to meet Professor Celia Kourie in our interfaith committee. She's the one who came up with that initiative to meet you in a more formal way. She's an expert. We'll listen to her later. Now, if you don't mind, I would like to pray the Lord for this meeting. Lord, we thank you for your caring. You providentially allowed this morning of encounter. Let it be really a transformative experience that we may become a bit better thanks to this encounter. Help us to overcome our anxiety or our fears or prejudice of being superior, of any wrong thought or feeling in our hearts. Purify us so that we may grow in humility and love. Amen.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful. Sheikh Mohammad Muslim is a Swedish Imam, spiritual guide and teacher. After embracing Islam in 1980, he was 21 years old. MashaAllah, Sheikh, you've been in this field for, 50 years? I'm not sure what's your age here.
I'm 60.
60. So 40 years at least. He traveled the world extensively, particularly North Africa and the Indian subcontinent. He settled in UK where he completed a 7-year Aliyah course. MashaAllah, Sheikh. He has since then worked as an imam and engaged at several mosques in the UK and Sweden. He taught Islam at universities and other institutions and engaged in dialogue and debates about interreligious cooperation and the role of religion in the modern world. Without taking much of your time, I call upon Sheikh to address us, inshallah.
Thank you. Now I can start. Yes, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon you and the mercy of God and His blessings. I am very honored to be here. I'm very delighted about this. And the whole coming about of this event, really. The journey to South Africa was planned, the taking part in the upcoming conference was planned, and then this perfect dot above the I appeared. Thanks to, among others, Munira Haeri, who really suggested to me, and I think to Christophe Boyer as well, that we should sort of interact upon this. And with the effort and concern of so many others, Celia Kourie among others as well, Aliyah, Batul, this came about, and it is so fantastic because the upcoming conference is on the topic of the universality of the human quest. And this really is what it is about. It is the universality. We are all really one big family. We may have different nationalities, different ethnicities, different languages. Some of us are men, others are women, others may choose not to define. Some are younger, some are older. We're all different, but we are also all the same. In essence, we are all the same. At the surface, at the face of it, we're all different, but at the core, in the depth of our innermost being, we are all the same. And in the same way, our religions, they are different, they have different forms, but the content is the same. That which is the only really important thing, but which cannot also manifest without the form. The whole of, this is my understanding, this is actually one verse in a poem by Muhammad ibn al-Habib from Morocco. Some of his poetry are, I think we usually keep them here in the Romana and sing it sometimes as well. And there's one verse there which really, to me, defines the whole existence. And it is, إِنَّمَا الْكَوْنُ مَعَانٍ قَائِمَاتٌ بِالصُّوَرِ. That the whole of existence is just meaning, which is manifest by form. And the same, I think, religion. The meaning is the same, the forms are different. We cannot have the meaning without the form, hence we need the form. But if we get caught up in the form, and if we get too overwhelmed by our differences, we will then not be able to see and appreciate that which we have in common. So let us find and enjoy and realize that we are all really the same, at the same time as we can celebrate these differences which really make life interesting. Thank you.
Before I call upon the next speaker, I just want to ask, I want you to do me one favor. Just look around, what do you see? Look around you, what do you see? You see a miracle. Every human being is a miracle. I mean, can you imagine? We got everything we want. Rumi says that everything you're looking for is inside you. Allah has blew His Spirit into us. And that's the power we have. We have the power that Allah has blessed us with. Therefore, everyone that we're looking around is a walking, talking miracle. Can you imagine how blessed we are? Our next speaker is Sister Aliyah. We all know her. More than 30 years experience as a spiritual counselor, life coach, mentor. Aliyah has conducted workshops and courses on self-knowledge and personal excellence in the UK, Sweden, Germany, Pakistan, South Africa, United States. She even had a session with our family as well. And really, they were all very excited and enjoyed it. And they called her back, but somehow or the other, she's been too busy, but she will, inshallah, follow up. Aliyah has addressed conferences in London, in the School of Economics. Also, she's been interviewed with the BBC, with World Service, with also an SABC TV in South Africa. Aliyah believes in something we have within us, and that each one of us has potential to fulfill not only our dreams and aspiration, but also to bring about healing. Now, we all got a built-in pharmacy. I really believe that built-in pharmacy is right within you. And the names of Allah are triggers for transformation, triggers to heal the body. So we got to use those names wisely. And I call upon Sister Aliyah to address us.
Good morning. Salam alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Namaste. Okay. The topic this morning for our conversation and reflection is on Ibn Arabi, the great Sufi mystic and philosopher, and the Sufi masters, his female Sufi masters who greatly influenced his life. Now, Ibn Arabi is considered in the Islamic Sufi tradition as the greatest philosopher and writer, ranging on topics that cover the Islamic sciences, in particular commentaries on the Quran, the sayings of the Prophet, and the wide, broad range of Islamic law and jurisprudence, as well as the more inner meditative aspects of remembrance of God. Among the several hundred books that he has written are folios of only 2 or 3 pages and very lengthy volumes of books, of which his greatest magisterial work is called the Meccan Openings, the Futuhat al-Makkiyah. The Meccan Openings, which has only been translated in part, when it is completed in its modern version, will number 15,000 pages in that single volume. In his life, Ibn Arabi is not, Ibn Arabi became very well known, although a controversial figure, among the Muslim lands within a century of his lifetime, but remained fairly unknown in the West. And it's only in recent years that he has come to prominence and his work is being translated. Amongst the scholars who have committed their lives and their teaching and their work to understanding this great sheikh, the consensus is that the translations are so rich and multi-layered that it will take great depth of commitment to begin to delve into the inner meanings as well as the explicit outer statements that he makes. Ibn Arabi himself said something very interesting. He said, when you read anything for your own knowledge, whatever you understand is correct. Meaning, I'm sure, according to one's level of consciousness, it's correct in your understanding. But he encouraged that the more we minimize distractions in our lives, the greater the openness to understand the voice of prophecy, the voice of the divine realm, the voice of truth that seeks to manifest itself through writings such as his. He was, several centuries after his passing, he was called in the Sufi tradition Shaykh al-Akbar, the greatest sheikh, the greatest master, a title that means, according to the understanding and the language of the day, that there has never been, nor will there ever be, a philosopher, a human being, who could bring forward, unearth the treasures of the Islamic knowledges and the Quran as he did, with such detail and profundity. So it's really a privilege to share with you a few stories about what he learned from his women Sufi teachers and why and why he put forward a new position for women in our understanding, both in the outer world of gender and the inner world of spiritual pursuit. Ibn Arabi was born in 1165 in Murcia, Spain, which is in the rich Moorish culture of Andalusia. And he died in Damascus in 1640. Ibn Arabi grew up in a middle-class family. His father was a government official, and he was educated. He was given a standard education in, of course, the Quran, in Islamic studies, also in languages. He studied both Jewish and Christian theologies with some depth, Greek philosophy, and mathematics. Now, when he was in his teens, he had a mystical conversion on the hands of Jesus, albeit it's Jesus in the Quran, where it opened up for him access to the divine realm. And from then on, for the rest of his life, this accessibility, this openness that he had in seeing beyond the world of concrete form, followed him throughout his life. And we will see that some of his greatest works, for example, the Basils of Wisdom, the Fusus al-Hikam, which is his commentary on the deep inner meanings and treasures of the various prophets in the Quran and the Bible. This is his most popular work, and it's a beautiful read because it touches your heart and opens your mind, and it feels like one adventure, one journey in reading. And Ibn Arabi himself wrote that how this book came to him is that he had a vision of the blessed prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, who appeared and handed him the book and said, "Now you write it." And so we are all the beneficiaries of this tremendous book. His life is peppered with this openness to the subtle realms where meaning takes form. So most of us probably don't commit ourselves to opening up to the universe, so we tend to live in this concrete world. But someone like Ibn Arabi, who from this very early age had an inner conversion to knowing that this was the real. But then this outer world carries us along with it. They're inseparable, the undifferentiated sameness, which is the topic of the gathering to come. And so he lived with responsibility in the world, looking after his family and sisters, ensuring proper marriages and education and so on. But his heart and his attention always went into this journey of spiritual life, as he called it. Now, I would like to share some of some stories that particularly struck me amongst his female Sufi masters. The woman that had the greatest influence in his life was a woman of gnosis, of enlightenment, who lived in Cordoba, and her name was Fatima al-Muthana. He was a youth, maybe in his late teens, a young man by the time that he took commitment with her. And he said, I served her. He wrote about her in his book, Sufis of Andalusia. I served her. And by saying I served her, what he meant was I gave my entire self to learning from this person, so that whatever instruction came to me, I adhered to it. I followed her teachings with the intent of loyalty and devotion. And Sheikh Fatima herself said, why I love young Ibn Arabi so much. Imagine saying that to a group like this and singling out one murid, which is what she did, because her love for him was so overwhelming. And she said, why I love young Ibn Arabi is because when he comes to me, he brings all of himself. And when he leaves, he takes all of himself. No karma.
Brilliant.
Pristine,
Brilliant.
Pure, utter reality and truth. Ibn Arabi himself built a house for her made of reeds, and the house was as tall as she was, and she lived in that house until her death. Where he personally learned about her own state of spiritual station involved an incident when one of the women disciples, murids, came to Fatima, Sheikh Fatima, with a problem in her domestic life. And so she turned to young Ibn Arabi and said, please, with me, recite the first chapter of the Quran, which is the Surat al-Fatiha. It's the opening chapter that's often equated to the Lord's Prayer in Christianity. The intent is the same. It prepares you and it opens you up for some higher revelation. As they recited it, when they completed it, what Ibn Arabi saw was a three-dimensional ethereal figure forming itself and then going after this errant husband who was in pursuit of another woman and bringing him back to the murid who came to pleading for from Sheikh Fatima. And then Ibn Arabi knew that she truly was a woman of gnosis who had command of the inner and the outer. It sounds metaphorical, but stories like this have been recorded and documented by many individuals, including what we would call ordinary people in this world. This woman was replete and she had it on command. Otherwise, it mostly comes accidentally, or what seemingly looks like coincidence, synchrodestiny. Another incident involved a group of the murids in the village, in town, who one day saw young Ibn Arabi walking through town with a very disgusting looking creature in his palm. And thinking to themselves, I mean, he's an honored murid, what is he doing with that? So they scurried back to the Zawiya and approached Sheikh Fatima and said, you won't believe what we saw. There's young Ibn Arabi in the street, in public, holding this most abominable object in his hand. And the Fatima, being a woman of wisdom, said, all right, let's just wait till young Ibn Arabi comes to the Zawiya. And when he arrived, she repeated the story and asked what was the purpose of this, or what was did this happen? And Ibn Arabi replied, yes, of course it happened. I found this creature on the street and I looked at it and I said, if Allah could create something so despicable, who am I to not carry it? So I picked it up and brought it to a place of safety. So little do we know, meaning set up in forms. Something else that Ibn Arabi shared for all of us in his later writings is that if you read the Bible, if you read the Quran, or if you read any a spiritual document, and you read it again later, and it still strikes you as the same, then you've got to do some work on yourself. He also said, with regard to mystical experience, if you see God, if you see Allah, if you go into fana, obliteration of the self, but you do not see yourself with the One, then your mystical vision or your illumination is incomplete. And there are those who, we call them mad in Allah, mad in God, the mad folk, who have almost constant states of oblivion, where they're only caught up in what Mullah Sadra would call the third journey, where you're in the One, with the One, by the One. So you're totally in that state of bliss, if you like, but there's no reality to your life on the ground, and there's no service in the way of knowing the truth to the rest of creation. So, and his Ibn Arabi's teachings are full, replete with these wonderful treasures. Fatima al-Muthanna was 95 years old, and Ibn Arabi said, she was so beautiful that I could not bear to look directly at her face. And she lived a long life and died in the Zawiya. I think my 12 minutes.
No, you go.
I share one other story. There is, Ibn Arabi had several women teachers, but arguably and without doubt in his own hand, he has written about Fatima as the greatest influence on his life. And she has frequently told him that I am your spiritual mother and I am the light of your biological mother. So he is always bringing together the awareness of inseparability and tawheed and unity, divine unity, divine unity. That's the realm he walked into. Another teacher of his was named Shams, again in Cordoba, and she also had the secret of, he describes her in his book as being of very noble spiritual commitment, open-hearted, humble, and she knew how to protect her soul and to develop her soul. She had the secret of being able to know the future and know the thoughts of some of her disciples. He experienced this as what happens, how these gifts are given to you when we release and make space by letting go of that which obstructs our own connection with our with inner truth and with revelation from without, from within from without, from within. Ibn Arabi eventually became his own master and had many, many women followers. He wrote a diwan, which are divinely inspired poems, poetry. Often they're sung too. In his diwan, he mentions that he gave the cloak, the Sufi cloak, the kirka, to 14 of his circle. And what that means is, by bestowing the Sufi cloak upon you, is a recognition that a degree of commitment to the higher teachings of unity and the real have been accomplished by that person. So it's an acknowledgement of the state and the maqam, the station of that person. And he said, of the 14, 13 were women. So again, his personal spiritual journey seems to be giving him an opening, so that how astonishing is it that 8 centuries ago, he actually put forth a new position for women in life, in terms of gender and social justice, and equally importantly, if not more for some, and on the inner dimension, where they can be seen spiritually on the equal of men. In other words, on the level of your inner awakening and spirituality, there is no difference between men and women. I want to close this by saying that because of the focus of the topic today, we concentrated on his interaction with women. It does not mean, with his women teachers, it does not mean that he did not have, that he did not encounter great male Sufi masters, which he did along his journey through the Middle East. He is seen with gratitude as trying to redress an imbalance that had long existed in medieval part of the world where he lived and traveled. So this is probably why we so appreciate, we meaning those who are discovering him today, East and West, are appreciative of the man, because they see in our modern day a need also to restore to women, as Shaykh Fadhlalla oftenly says, to restore to women their proper place in the stage of life. Finally, we focused on the outer aspects of his women teachers. Inwardly, what Ibn Arabi ascribed to his love for women is the feminine principle. It's a cosmological aspect of the way the universe is created, in which the balance, which you see in every world religion and spiritual tradition, between yin and yang, between beauty and majesty, and so on, come together in a unified experience by balancing the feminine and the masculine principle. So he saw the meaning within the form of the woman. It's not just because she happened to be biologically female, but he saw the meaning of the feminine principle coming to balance the the great really outpouring of the great Sufi masters in medieval centuries. And for that we always express our gratitude. Finally, I was so grateful to see this about Ibn Arabi, is that he was a great Quranic commentator, and that's often not remembered because his mystical experiences are so great. But he often began every discourse quoting 1 or 2 verses of the Quran, and then springing off or diving deep into the inner dimensions. He said, I understood, Ibn Arabi says, I understood why Sitta Isha said that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessings, was the Quran walking, because within the Prophet himself he contained the inner and the outer dimensions. In other words, the interspace. All human beings are in interspace. We call it a barzakh in Sufi terminology. So we are walking barzakhs, unifying the inner and the outer just within our human form, our created image. And when Ibn Arabi continues his discourse, he said, and I am also Quran walking, which surely he was once you begin to even dip into the most meager of his treatises. So these are some of the gifts that we have been given by this remarkable teacher, and all those who companioned his life, both as teachers and as learners. And may we be grateful not only for the legacy left behind, but the living teachers amongst us today, if we could only see truly the depths of their meaning within their created form. Thank you.
Alhamdulillah, Sister Aliyah, you threw boulders in the stagnant pool of our mind, really. Those are boulders. We have to really go in depth and study Ibn Arabi, inshallah. Our next speaker is Celia Kourie. Sister Celia Kourie, professor from Emerita, UNISA Research Fellow, and originally from London, member of the religious order in the UK for 8 years, and has been in South Africa since the 16th of June. You came exactly when those riots took place. Okay. When the changes in South Africa really started. So it looks like you may have had something to do with it. Anyway, okay. I worked in the chaplain at the University of Pretoria before joining the Faculty of Theology. And of course, she's specializing in Carmelite mysticism. I'd like to address us, inshallah.
Good morning. Salam alaikum. Lovely to see some Sufi sisters and brothers that I met last year. It's so nice to be back. I feel as I've come home again. So lovely to be with you, and thank you for this opportunity to share a few thoughts on John of the Cross. So, thank you. Thanks. Speak louder, yes. John of the Cross, can you all hear me? I know my voice isn't very loud. Can you hear me at the back? John of the Cross is a remarkable...
They can hear you.
They can hear. Okay, thanks. Is a remarkable Spanish mystic, 16th century. In terms of his thought and his teaching, I'd like to take you right to the end of his teaching, and then we come back to his life and his other thoughts. Because once we know where we're going with John of the Cross, we have a much better idea of how all the events in his life influenced him. And just in passing, including meeting Teresa of Avila when he was about to join another more rigid religious order. So it's rather interesting now from the previous talk that we have now a meeting with him and Teresa that changed his life completely. But to come back to what the essence of his teaching is, I'd like to take us all right to the very last verse of his last poem, which is called The Living Flame of Love. And this last couple of sentences speaks about the breathing of the Holy Spirit in God, which he calls the spiration of the Spirit, the inner breathing of the Spirit. Just a few lines of that verse. In your sweet breathing, filled with good and glory, how tenderly you swell my heart with love. Now, when we look at all the religious traditions, the place of the breath is central. And in terms of John's poetry, he's leading us all to this position where it is the Spirit within, God within, letting go of the self. We'll come back to that a little bit more later. But it does mean that we could sum up his teaching in a couple of words: transformation in God, transformation in the divine, however we give, whatever name we give to this wonderful mystery of the divine. Now moving on a little bit to elaborate a little bit more on his basic message. In one of his most famous poems, the Spiritual Canticle, which is based on the Song of Songs in the Hebrew Bible, he speaks of the sketch of love that the beloved gives to the individual. And let me just read you some of this. When there is union of love, the image of the beloved is so sketched in the wills. It's a sketch, it's a drawing, and drawn so intimately and vividly that it is true to say that the beloved lives in the lover and the lover in the beloved. Love produces such likeness in this transformation of lovers that one can say each is the other and both are one. And I must admit, I don't know enough about the Sufi mystics, but I think I know enough to say this is very similar to many of the great Sufi mystics, of course, Rumi in particular, but as we were chatting earlier, Rabia and Hafiz and some of these wonderful writers. And it's been a bit encouraging for me now to go back and do a little bit more research on the similarities between these great mystics. The fact of John speaking like this, it's very daring language because, as we know, the Inquisition was still in process, and people knew that if they thought and spoke out of turn, that would be the end. So he kind of covers himself in his writing. He puts in his work a little note to say, I accept this is all within the magisterium of the church. So he covers himself. But he is still pretty daring in his language. And after he died, many of his works were burned. Some of the beautiful sayings we have are fortunate we've got some, but many of them were destroyed. It's interesting because Teresa Fadhlalla, whom I'll come to in a moment, she also had a kind of rhetorical device to placate those who wanted to control their ideas. So Teresa says in her writings, which are also magnificent, she says, but as for me, I'm just a weak, poor woman. What do I know? And she always defers to the clergy. But it was really just a device to get out of that dilemma. So John, very much a love of the Bible. It's said that he took the Bible everywhere. He knew every aspect of the Bible. And of course, his approach was Christocentric, but as we saw now, it moves more and more into the reality, the total reality of the Spirit, Now, in one of the letters to the Carmelite sisters, he writes something very beautiful. Let me read this to you. Serve God, my beloved daughters in Christ, following in his footsteps, mortifying yourselves if something still impedes the inner resurrection of the Spirit who dwells within your soul. And that phrase for me is so pertinent. It links up with this last verse of the living flame of love, the inner resurrection of the Spirit. So it's an interior transformation, which of course will later on have implications for life. As Aliyah just said now, if you can't bring it back to everyday life, it's not going to help many people. But he speaks of this wonderful reality, the inner reality, and actually, as I say this, I feel I'm bringing coals to Newcastle. Do you know that expression in England? When we were talking earlier about Scotland, you know, Newcastle is a place of coal. So I feel certainly sort of that all of this is so much part of your understanding of life, Sufism, but of life. But maybe what we can do today is see how John is able to share with us in maybe a slightly different way. But we have it in the other mystics, Meister Eckhart, who speaks about a working mysticism. In a sense, there are two levels, the inner mystical reality and at the same time the outer reality of this world. And also, if we could look at the Tao Te Ching in verse 35, beautiful, hold fast to the great form within, and let the world pass as it may. Then the changes of life will not bring pain, but contentment, joy, and well-being. And as I read some of the Sufi writings, I'm just saying, yes, yes, this is it, this is it. He has been misunderstood by many people. I didn't bring the complete works with me. In fact, it's quite a heavy tome. And some people see this and they start reading from the beginning, and that's not the way to go. We have to read his poems first, then read the commentaries. So he's been misunderstood, but in a sense, we've forgotten that he was acclaimed as the patron of Spanish poetry as recently as the 1950s. So Spain have recognized him a long time afterwards, but in terms of how to read him, he was writing primarily for contemplative sisters and brothers, so they were already leading a very contemplative life. Prayer was the essence of their life. So we have to take that into account when we read him. And he himself says, some of my writing is very difficult to understand. Please read it 2 or 3 times before you get the message. And I think those of us who've been involved in academic projects, we know how this is actually the truth. A lot of the writing is terse. It's terse. One has to get to the essence. Just briefly on his life, and you'll understand, I don't know if many people know his life story, but you'll understand the absolute centrality of suffering in his early life and his later life as a Carmelite friar. He was born in 1542. His father had married a person below the status of the father, and the father's family disowned him, disowned the whole family. And even when the father died later on, after the children were born, that family refused to help in any way. I can't believe that somehow, but it is the case. So he grew up extremely poor. He lost one brother. His other brother, Francisco, he loved dearly, and it comes into his writings. So in a way, we see in his love for his family a slightly different take on his rather austere teachings, leave family, leave everyone, and just follow God. No, it's actually not like that. He himself was a very compassionate and loving person, and that is due also to the fact that he worked in a hospital. He was given a patronage, and he worked in a hospital and studied, and eventually became a Carmelite priest. But in 1567, he was thinking of joining a much stricter order of friars. I think he felt the Carmelites might have been talking too much, and he wanted to go into more silence, and the Carthusians are much more strict, and so on. But then he met Teresa of Avila. Now, Teresa of Avila was at that stage involved in the reform of Carmel, the sisters' wing. So in the Carmel of those days, they only had the one type of Carmelite life, which was getting very lax. It wasn't keeping to the original vision. Of course, they take it back to Elijah on Mount Carmel, so it's the origin of prayer. Teresa said, no, don't go to the Carthusians, stay with me and help with the reform of the brothers. So she was working with the sisters, and he agreed, and it changed his life in many ways. Teresa was so different from John. She was, well, a Spanish temperament anyway, but ebullient and passionate and talkative. And when she writes, if you ever read her writings, she writes and writes and writes without any punctuation or paragraphs and all of that. She was a very effusive person. And John, of course, was very quiet, studious, introvert. And suddenly he now has this encounter, and his whole life from then on is working with Teresa. It had many advantages. Well, for both of them, you can understand that Teresa would learn a lot from his own wisdom and knowledge. She wasn't into the intellectual side of things. But for John too, his poems were often put to music in the sisters' recreation. So he would then be part of a community where the sisters would sing these poems and even dance. I think that probably was very difficult for John in the beginning, but it was a very valuable sort of, what would you call it, companionship, friendship between the two very different personalities. Jumping ahead very quickly to the rest of his life, the wing of the brothers that he was now trying to reform were not at all happy with the reforms. And to put it in a nutshell, in 1577, they abducted him. They took him to a prison in the monastery. One can hardly imagine that you have prisons in monasteries, but this was 16th century Spanish Catholicism, and if you don't toe the line, you know what's going to happen. And he was imprisoned for 9 months in a tiny little cell, very, very poorly treated, hardly had any good food, taken to the refectory, the dining room, and flagellated and told he must renounce all of this in a Christian community. When I think of it, I still can't imagine that that could have happened, but it did. And eventually, he was able to escape. But before he did that, he composed 31 verses of the spiritual canticle, not the dark night of the soul, which many people think, and they misunderstand the dark. We often misunderstand in the dark night of the soul. It's actually also a beautiful poem of letting go and finding the divine. But many people take the passages where he talks of suffering in the dark night, and they forget the other side of it. So he didn't compose that when he was undergoing such torture. He composed the spiritual canticle, which is all about the lover and the beloved searching and finding and going up the mountain and eventually finding union in the divine. So it's rather interesting, because most of us, when we're in a situation of extreme suffering, tend to dwell on the suffering and not on the spiritual enrichment that he was teaching us. Yeah. Yes. Mm. So he escaped. He was rather clever. He managed to undo the lock a little bit. One of the more recent guards had put the key in rather lightly, and he was able to get out. And that same guard had given him a scrap of paper, just a scrap, where he could start writing some of these beautiful mystical verses. Prior to that, it was all in his head. So he managed to return. The sisters looked after him. He took on a number of very important administrative posts. They have provincials and superiors and all this sort of thing. So it wasn't as though he was praying all day and writing poetry all day and all of that. No, he was actually living a very, very detailed administrative type of life with the brothers. The strange thing about the final stage of his life, which I'll go through very quickly, the reform took off. So the reformed brothers became a separate wing with Teresa's sisters. So there were 2 reformed areas. And they are what is called the OCDs, not obsessive compulsive disorder. But I sometimes wonder that maybe people with obsessive compulsive disorder might find their niche in a very rigid setting. But anyway, the new wing was the OCDs, and the previous wing was the OCARMs, Order of Carmelites, and then the OCDs. They were called the Order of Descalced Carmelites because they didn't wear shoes. That was part of the reform. I believe they wore sandals at some point. So he helped them, and again there were politics and meetings and provincials and stuff, and he was then ostracized by his own brothers of the reform. Can you imagine what pain that must have been? So his life was full of suffering, and the last part of his life he chose to go to a monastery where he wasn't so very well known, and the prior of that monastery did not like John. Again, Christian community. I don't like this guy, you know, I don't like. It's quite amazing, but he took an intensive dislike to John, and John got very ill. He had an ulcerated leg at that time. He didn't ask for good medical care. He wasn't given sufficient medical care. And before he died, he asked to see the prior of the order of that congregation. He, John, apologized to the provincial, saying, "I'm so sorry if I have caused you any inconvenience." Isn't this ironic? But it's said in the sources that that particular prior just listened in tears and left John's room as he was almost ready to die. And from then on, that particular provincial or whoever changed completely and became an extremely holy person. So it was a catalyst for him. But again, it's kind of unbelievable when we look back on these historical situations. As a result, suffering was very central in his life. He prayed for suffering. He prayed for an early death. Now, I think in today's contemporary spirituality, that is not really how we think of real spirituality anymore. We see much more of a wellness spirituality. In fact, why do we need to pray for suffering when we have it anyway? There's enough suffering that comes to all of us in one way or another. But it was certainly the sort of spirituality of the day. And as we will see, he died young, 49. But when I get to the next part of this presentation, we will look at the final poem, and we will see this is a poem for longing for the divine and tearing the veil and going through to the reality. So we already saw just at the beginning that the final reality is the spiration of the spirit. And this is encapsulated in his major themes throughout all his poems. And of course, there won't be time to go through much of this morning, but it's basically union with the divine, transformation, deification, which in many Christian circles is not considered orthodox teaching. But when we go right back to the Eastern wing of Christianity and we look at the concept of theosis, being transformed, deification, and his faith was very, very much Christ-centered. But all of that led to, all of these practices and prayers and everything led to one word which sums up his spirituality, his mysticism, and that word is nada. Nada in Spanish, meaning nothing, emptiness, nothing. And interestingly, in today's spirituality, a lot of that is coming back through Eastern mysticism and so on. And for John, it didn't mean nihilism and nothingness in a negative sense. It meant nada, so that todo could come, the nothingness and the all, nada and todo. Many people don't realize that he wrote sayings of light and love, small little sayings, and he used to give these to the sisters. I could imagine in comparison, we could say it's a bit like Twitter. You know, if one of the masters has got a Twitter account, you can send out your Twitter. They didn't have it then, so he wrote out these little messages and he gave them to the sisters and they treasured them. Can you imagine, you know, receiving particular messages? Some of them are so beautiful. Let me just give you a couple. Because what happens with John, often people just go to the poems and the commentary and they don't realize the other aspects of his work. There are about 175. Many, I think, were destroyed after his death because they were not in accordance with orthodoxy. Number 29 says, "A soul enkindled with love is a gentle, meek, humble and patient soul." And number 60, "When evening comes, you will be examined in love. Learn to love as God desires to be loved and abandon your own ways of acting." And number 66, he says, "In tribulation, immediately draw near to God with trust, and you will receive strength, enlightenment, and instruction." Very practical admonitions, but based on that deep interior and wonderful spirituality. Even in his letters, I must just mention that as a person involved in looking after the order and the practicalities of the order, he had to deal with a lot of injustice. He had to deal with legal matters, with court matters. You know, you tend to think, let me put it this way, we often look at these wonderful spiritual gurus and masters and think, no, they're in a plane right up there. But when we get to know about their lives, they had to deal with, you know, recalcitrant sisters and brothers and all sorts of issues in the order. But nevertheless, he has a way of somehow imbuing his letters with mystical wisdom. He wrote to one of the sisters, "Think nothing else but that God ordains all. And where there is no love, put love, and you will draw out love." Now, coming to his poetry, I'd like to take us, before the very last well-known poem, I'd like to take us to one not so well-known. And it just links up with Rumi, to my mind, in this particular instance. I just happened to come across, I'm sorry I can't quote the exact one this morning, but he says in this poem, "Love works so in me that whether things go well or badly, love turns them to one sweetness." Sweetness. There is something of Rumi there, isn't it? I think he uses that expression. "Transforming the soul into itself. And so in its delighting flame, which I am feeling within me, swiftly, with nothing spared, I am wholly being consumed." It's quite strong. It's fire, it's flame, it's being consumed. And it's not sort of airy-fairy spirituality. And actually, when we look at other mystics, Jan van Ruysbroek, for example, speaks of a torrent of love that takes us over. And John here is talking about that flame of love. And if you remember, he's got the analogy of the log and the flame, and then the log gets burnt more and more fiercely. So moving to that last verse again, to the living flame of love, and then I'll bring it to a conclusion. He wrote this poem in 2 weeks, and the commentary, because he wrote it for a female friend, another interesting facet, because in the 16th century, women were not really considered that you should be writing for them and so on, very male-dominated. And there was a feeling that women generally were more hysterical, so to give them this type of spiritual prayer could be dangerous, rather than let them stay with mental prayer, where you're always praying, you know, specific words and so on. But he wrote this poem in 2 weeks, and it's all about the power of the Spirit to transform. And in contrast to his previous poems, especially the Spiritual Canticle, which speaks of a progression, the living flame of love is just an elaboration of what is. There's no more movement upwards. It has happened. It is a present reality. So the let me just come to that last verse. The themes in this poem are transformation, interiorization, transmutation of suffering, desire for heaven, and the beauty of death. The beauty of death. Not really the sort of spiritual poems that we read about today. People are scared of death, they're worried about death. Actually, even the word death, I think for people like John, death is rather a harsh word. There is no death. It's just a transition, whatever we want to call it. So in terms of Sufi spirituality, when I read some of your wonderful works, it makes sense what he's saying. What perhaps doesn't make so much sense is the desire for death. You know, there's no need for us to hasten death or desire it to come. And especially when you're younger. You know, a lot of younger people here probably don't think too much about dying, you know. But as we get a bit older, we do tend to give it a little bit more thought, perhaps. But it isn't a negative thing. It's the most positive, beautiful positive approach that he has. And when I was reading through this particular poem, I remembered and looked up something of Hafiz, you know, that wonderful 10th century Sufi poet, quite incredible poet. And he says here, love sometimes gets tired of speaking sweetly and wants to rip to shreds all your erroneous notions of truth. The beloved sometimes wants to do us a great favor, hold us upside down and shake all the nonsense out. Isn't that beautiful, Hafiz? And in a very sort of subdued way, this is what John is doing. And when it comes to the final realization, because we've just seen how it's the work of the Spirit, it leads to not annihilation of the self in a negative sense, but a loss of self. And he speaks of this happening in the deepest center of his being. And he speaks in terms of this happening as a light shining on a clean and pure crystal. So we find that the more intense the degree of light, the more light the crystal has concentrated within it, and the brighter it becomes. It can become so brilliant from the abundance of light received that it seems to be all light. Beautiful and scriptural, very much close to the New Testament teachings, but very much in tune with Hinduism, Buddhism, the clear mirror. Paul in his letters writing about the mirror of Christ. He also says with respect to the Father, he quotes James 1:17, where he speaks of the Father of lights. And he says, God is not close-fisted. Isn't that an incredible description? It's not, the divine is not close-fisted, but diffuses himself abundantly as the sun does its rays, without being a respecter of persons, wherever there is room, like a sunbeam. And then this, he says, is like a blazing furnace. This blazing furnace, but it's a gentle blazing furnace. There's a bit of a contradiction there. So thank you. Just the last few words then with respect to his desire. Reveal your presence. Let me go. Let me come. Let me be one with you. It's if you have the opportunity to look at some of these poems, look at the living flame of love. It's only 4 stanzas. And in the end, we learn from him that it is just what he calls a tearing of the veil, a breaking through of the veil. And he speaks somewhere of the veil getting less and less dense. What's the word? Yes. And it's almost as though the veil has already been opened or you shine through, the reality is shining through. So we started off with looking at the fact that it's the work of the Spirit and it's the inspiration of the Spirit. And then if you have time to look at some of his poems later, there's a journey, there's a progression. But when it comes to the final poem, The Living Flame of Love, this is the reality. And I think what is interesting for us in today's spirituality, where there's an emphasis of living in the moment, living in the now, that John's teaching, although it's rather dense, can actually bring us back to that realization. But I thought I must give Rumi the last word, because Rumi and dying and death and all of that, it's also this wonderful mystical encounter. So it's not death. I don't know, we could use another word perhaps instead of death. Death seems a bit harsh. You know, the very word seems a bit harsh. I know I've shared with a few people, some friends here, this friend who started an interspirituality centre for us in Hartbeespoort Dam in Pretoria. I mentioned to him once so-and-so had died, and he said, died? No, they just dropped to the body. They just dropped to the body, which is true. But it's just a little bit awkward if you want to say, my grandmother dropped her body last week. You know. It's not really colloquial language. But Rumi says, this is how I would die into the love I have for you, as pieces of cloud dissolve in sunlight. At the end of my life, with just one breath left, if you come, I'll sit up and sing. Thank you very much.
A'udhu billahi minash shaitani rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful. We thank Almighty Allah for blessing us with a beautiful community here, a very beautiful group. And I just want to make a little comment on what Sister spoke about last. In every difficulty, there's a seed of prosperity. Just remember that. When you go through difficulty, there is that seed. You've got to just look for it, inshallah. I'd like to call upon Reverend Helene Egnell. She's a priest and a journalist, having first graduated and has got a degree in journalism, studied theology, obtained a PhD at the university in Sweden. For a long time, she was a priest at a local congregation in Stockholm. She studied Christian feminist approach of religious plurality. And she's going to speak on the Center of Religious Dialogue in Stockholm. Call upon our sister to address us.
So, peace be with you. Salam alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
I was asked to talk a bit about the work we do at the Center for Interfaith Dialogue in Stockholm, in the Diocese of Stockholm, where I am one of 2 co-workers. And we've been about for 11 years now. You could say, and it's to say that we are not an interreligious center as such. We're run by the Church of Sweden, the diocese. And I think we stand on 3 legs. And one is equipping the parishes and Christian people generally and encourage them to engage in interfaith dialogue by giving courses, by giving good advice, counseling and so on. And then the other leg, of course, is building interfaith relations, being part of and building up networks. Like we just started an interreligious council in Stockholm, which is on the leadership level. And then we have the Interreligious Peace Forum, which is more like an activist network for people of various religions who engage in interfaith dialogue. And the third leg would be to try to take part in public discourse, maybe being interviewed by journalists, writing articles, and we also have a blog, a Facebook page, and so on, where we can publish material that could be of interest to people engaged in interfaith dialogue. And I often say that our main task is to help the parishes to reflect upon how to be a folk church in a multi-religious society. Be religious interreligiously, as I think Peter Fan has coined it. And then I should tell you that Sweden has been a mono-religious, monocultural country for very, very many years. And the Church of Sweden, which is a ridiculous name because there are loads of churches in Sweden by now, but it is the old state church, and we were disestablished in the year 2000. So now we're more or less one church among others, but considering that I think now 65% of the population belong to the Church of Sweden, which is for us an alarmingly low figure, because we used to be 90 or 95%. And how do we deal with this? Having been tied to the government, if you were Swedish, you belonged to the Church of Sweden. I remember meeting a widow. I was taking the funeral of her husband, and we talked about, and that was before the year 2000, and we talked about this disestablishment, and she said, "What's that? If you're Swedish, you belong to the Church of Sweden. What's the fuss?" So that would have been the mindset, really. And now, and being a folk church, it means being a church for all of the people, not just the pious one, not just the ones who attend church every Sunday, but to everyone. To be there for them both when they're in need spiritual advice, but also doing a lot of social work and so on. So I think we are in a difficult time because we have to totally rethink our identity. And now, this happened in 2000, and now we are 19 years old. So we are in our late teens, and that can be a very difficult time for people. But I think it still hasn't really dawned upon everyone that this is a situation. Many people think that we're still in the old days, and that, people will come back to the church, and all those immigrants, they will return to their home countries and so on. I think that's not consciously, but I think that's the unconscious mindset of many people. So helping people to realize that this is the situation, and also all the things with the occasional services. Muslim wants to marry a Christian, and how do you do the marriage service when they get a baby and they are not sure, should they baptize it or should it become a Muslim, or should they wait? And these are totally new questions for the priests and the parishes. So there's a lot to deal with. And unfortunately, I think we're far behind in this, but we're trying to push these questions and make people understand that this is what the future holds. And the other side of that, I would say, is to explain to other believers the religious mindset of post-Protestant Swedes. And I say post-Protestant because we joined the Reformation in the 16th century, and we're a Lutheran church, and now people don't define themselves as Lutheran, and they are very not really into saying that I'm a religious person. I mean, you get a lot of the spiritual, not religious, and people don't identify as Christians, but I think that they do more and more as other believers come. Then you have to say, you're a Muslim and I'm a Christian. What does that mean? What does it mean to be a Christian? Because they never had to think about it, because it was just the normal way to be. You married in the church, you baptized your children, and you were buried in the church. And that's how it was. Yeah. So that's... But still, I think that, and I don't know if you know about the World Values Survey, where they have a big questionnaire sent out all over the world to talk about the values people hold, and there is a scale between traditional and modern and individual and collective. And we always say that, well, Sweden is a middle of the way country. It's not. It's in the most upper part of the individual rationalistic side. But that being said, we're slowly realizing that really people do hold religious beliefs, and they still have Protestant ideas about things. And I think that one thing that we should maybe do more is to explain to other believers that Martin Luther, he reformed the church, and he said that all those fasts and all of those things that you do, that's adiaphora. It's form. It's form, and you don't need to care about that. But maybe carry it a bit too far. And that means that Swedes are generally a bit suspicious of people who wear outward signs of religion. So I think when people are, because there's a great hostility against hijabis, for instance, and I think it's not just that they're xenophobic and they have ideas about Islam. It's about, well, you don't wear these outward signs. That's just superficial. You're being ceremonious. That's not the thing to do. So I think that might help to understand. And also, I didn't think of this before, but a friend of mine explained that pork, that was the only kind of meat that ordinary people or poor people possibly could afford. So maybe not for the young ones, but for the old ones, to say that you don't eat pork. You think you're sort of such a fine person that you can't eat the kind of meat that ordinary people eat. So I think these things are really, and that's, I think that lingers on from being more consciously Protestant, but all these ideas about religion is something interior, and you shouldn't boast about it, you shouldn't make too much fuss about how you are religious. So I think that's another challenge. And the third thing I would like to take up here is that I also think that we have an important task in building trust in a time of suspicion. Because we're living a time of polarization where lots of things are thrown about the others, be they just because they are immigrants or because they are black or because they're Muslims or Jews or whatever. And there are forces who try to fuel this. So how can we learn to build trust instead? And building trust, it's not easy. It's not easy because all the years of religious wars and suspicion and talking bad about each other, they still linger. So if you just use the wrong word inadvertently, it might spark a big conflict. Like we had a gathering with the Interreligious Council of Sweden a couple of weeks ago, and a Christian presenter, he talked about a statement that had been done by the European Council of Churches, and it used the word idol. And I mean, when we use today the word idol, we think about materialism, wealth, success, because those are the things that are the most important in your life, when it should really be God who is the most important. So we have come to use that as a metaphor for things that are too important in your life. But there were some Hindus present, and they admitted, what do you mean by idols? So they of course thought that for them, Christians have sort of looked down upon their gods and their way of presenting them and the form that faith is taking. So it's immensely important to build trust, and I think that it can only come from encounters. I mean, you can read how many books about Islam, and you will still read it through your lenses with your prejudices about Islam. But then when you meet an actual Muslim, so that's why we're so happy to have Imam Muslim in Stockholm. So now, right now, we have a course where we meet 3 times, and Mohammad will answer all the questions you have about Islam but have never dared to ask. And then when they see such a non-threatening and gentle person as Mohammad Muslim, I think that will do more for their understanding of Islam than any books. So during these 3 meetings, we build relations, and they know what a good Muslim looks like, and that you can really talk to me and put any questions and have good conversations. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to tell you. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Shaykh Muslim. Needs no introduction. We all know him.
You've already introduced
I
me
already
anyway.
introduced you once before.
Bismillah. I like flatter, so I could say that please don't flatter me, but I would be dishonest. So please flatter me. That's okay. Thank you, Helene, for flattering me. I mentioned in my maybe rather brief introduction in the morning, I wasn't really prepared. I had looked at another version of the schedule for the event, so I was a bit confused. Never mind, I'm still confused. And that's fantastic. But I mentioned about this meeting being the dot above the I in this whole journey to South Africa. The main purpose was the conference, which is starting tomorrow, and Saturday, Sunday being the main days. And then this came as a very, very valuable sort of, dot above the I. And then I thought, the dot signifies something. It is said among Muslims that the whole of the Quran, which obviously we see as the word of God and contains everything, Quran itself says that God speaks about himself sometimes as we, have not left anything out of the book. So the Quran contains, according to Muslims, absolutely everything there is to contain. And it is said that everything which is contained within the Quran is contained in the first chapter, the Fatiha, the Muslim version of the Lord's Prayer, if you wish. And everything contained in the Fatiha is contained in the first verse. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, the Compassionate, the Merciful. And there are many reasons for this. I mean, the whole of the Quran deals with so many things, but generally the main issue, of course, is how to relate to ourselves, to the world around us, and to God. And 2 things, form and meaning, as I mentioned earlier. Form being, how do we interact with each other? How do we live our lives practically? What methods, what tools do we need to be able to achieve that which is the purpose of our lives? And then the meaning, that very purpose. As meaning cannot exist without form. And form without meaning is, yes, meaningless. So it deals with those things, and all of those things are very concisely, of course, contained in the Fatiha, in the first chapter of the Quran, which praising God and giving the most 2 main of God's attributes, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, the compassionate, the merciful, or however you would choose to translate them. Interestingly, both stemming from the Arabic word for womb, which makes them, in my understanding, very female or feminine qualities. And goes on then to our interaction with God. Only you we worship, only from you do we seek help. And then our expectations from how God will interact with us, lead us on the straight path. And then the path of those whom you have favored. So interacting with others, those who are neither cursed nor astray, those who have not really gone to one extreme nor to the other extreme. And it said that all that is contained in this first chapter of the Quran is contained in the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, because it is that which introduces everything. It introduces us to God, if you wish, and it is a practice among many Muslims that whatever you do it in the name of God. We have basically, the Quran teaches us, and the Prophet Mohammad, peace be upon him, teaches us that we should start every important work, every important task with the name of God. And usually we do this with that phrase, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So that contains the whole of the message of the Quran. And it is said that whatever is contained in this first verse is contained in the first letter, which is the Arabic letter Ba, roughly equivalent to B. B. Because Ba, as a particle in the Arabic language, is the connecting. Bismillah, in the name of God, with the aid of God, with the help of, with the agency of, or through the means of. Or, so Ba is al-ba'u lil-ilsaq. It connects things to each other. And here we come to what I was saying in the beginning. It is said that everything contained within that first letter, with that letter Ba, is contained within the dot. Because the dot signifies unity. And the unity of God, but also the unity of creation, the unity of everything, that we are all really one. Now, I was supposed to talk about something called God's house. We don't say the house of God because that's kind of already reserved for, at least among Muslims, a very particular concept, namely the Kaaba in Mecca. God's house is an idea, really, which is yet to materialize in bricks and mortar, but is already there in the interaction of people. And it is one of the suburbs of Stockholm where the Muslim community, very mixed, that particular suburb has a large number of nationalities, round about 100 maybe, or even more. And there is a Muslim community, fairly large, also rather mixed. And there is, as in every single sort of town, or Swedish suburbs, or the suburbs specifically of Stockholm, are very different to much of the rest of the world. It is not that you have an urban area and then you have sort of a sprawl and you have less and less dense population. You have like smaller and smaller houses or bigger and bigger gardens. It's rather that you have the city center, and then you have forest, and then you have a dot of concrete buildings, which is a suburb, and then you have forest, and then you have another suburb. So it's very dotted about. But in each of those dots, there will be a church, of Sweden church. Usually fairly modern building. Built in this enormous boom, which was called the Million Project program, the Million program, when after the World War, or really in the 60s mainly, I think, it was decided to build 1 million new dwellings in Sweden. Not dwellings for 1 million people, 1 million new dwellings. That's in a country with a total population of today 10 million, and then maybe around about 7 million or so. So an enormous project, an enormous program was. So all these dotted out suburbs are the result of that. And in each of those there will be a Church of Sweden. Church from that time, i.e. fairly modern, which means it doesn't look like a church. Or it doesn't look of our traditional idea or concept of what the church should look like. Now, in this particular place called Fisksätra, and I'm not even going to bother you with trying to explain what that means, it's just a name. The Muslims and the Christian community, the Church of Sweden Christian community, have had very good relations for a very long time. And done things together, had a dialogue more than anything had meetings. So when the time came for the Muslim community to get out of their basement mosque, which most of the prayer rooms or so-called mosques of the Muslim community in Sweden are in the basement, because that's the space that's available. And there are a few properly built mosques, and another few maybe buildings converted into mosques, but all the non-basement mosques in Sweden may total about 15. And all the other 300 or 400 are basement mosques. So here as well they have a basement mosque. Actually 2 now, but they had 1. But of course, as all Muslim community, we want a mosque, we want a building, we want this place. You can think what you like about that, but that's how it usually goes. And the idea came up that they should buy some land adjacent to the church, which belonged to the church, but they really had no need for it at that particular time. So a contract was signed that the Muslim community will buy this land of the church, and then this has not yet happened, partly or maybe even mainly because of financing. Any contributions are welcome. Thank you for the plug. Idea is to build a mosque next to the church with some space in between. Building regulations specify that anyway, 4.5 meters between buildings. Now that 4.5 meters, as well as some part which the church kindly will donate, will be a shared space, a common space, a common room between the church on one side, which incidentally a Church of Sweden Protestant church has opened up for the Catholic community. So there are also Catholic services taking place in this Church of Sweden church. I think this is not a very common occurrence in Sweden or elsewhere either. That is in itself is a great show of trust. And then the mosque on the one side. So the mosque will remain a mosque. We're not talking about mixing religion. We're not talking about making some sort of universal religion, although that appealing as that may be. But it is about realizing that our goal is the same, our needs are the same, our essence is the same. We have the mosque, we have our outer, our form, our shell, our practice. Even that, of course, differs. Welcome. I mean, the Church of Sweden, Lutheran Protestant Church, opened up for the Catholics. Maybe the Sunni mosque will open up for the Shias. I certainly hope so. I would be extremely disappointed if we don't. It's almost a threat, I think, from my side. The shared space will be just that, a meeting place. Whether you go to the mosque or whether you go to the church, you will pass through this same area, this same space, this same square.
MashaAllah.
Because I think the most important thing, yes, dialogue is important, studying is important, learning is important, know more about each other. The words of Hans Kung come to mind, that there can be no world peace without peace among religions, and there can be no peace among religions without, now you can translate this as you may, I take a bit of liberty there, without correct or deep and accurate knowledge of each other's religions, to learn, to get to know each other. But more even important than that, I think, is to meet each other, to meet people, to put a face to the name, to realize that we are all, as they say in Sweden, meat and blood. We are all in the flesh, we are all human beings with all our differences. We are all the same, but different. So this is a manifestation of that. And I hope it will succeed. Maybe it will, maybe it will not. Maybe this Muslim community will I've actually been appointed the chairman of the trust, by the way. This Muslim community may succeed in getting the funding or not. The Christian community is actually aiding by having another trust to support that trust, to arrange the finances. I think to a large part, maybe some of the Christians are more active even than many of the Muslims in this, who are involved in this project. But I hope it will succeed, and I hope it will be something that can be a meeting, that can be an opening up, that can teach us really that all our needs, what we desire really in the depth of our heart, and that what we are all about is all the same. And the difference is just that, different flavors, different colors, different languages to give some color. It is like, in essence, it is all black and white, and then these differences bring color to the picture. Thank you.
I think before the closing, is there any questions? Are there any questions to all the speakers? It's part of the agenda. How many Muslims are there in Sweden?
Well, I mean, if you ask some people, they will say one. Or they will say, I don't know, up to 500,000. The total population is 10 million. I think if you say people from a Muslim background or somehow or other will identify themselves or be identified by others as Muslims, you're touching the 500,000 mark.
Oh, alhamdulillah. MashaAllah.
So up to 5%.
That's very good. Any other questions?
Google says 8.1%. 10,000 Muslims.
How many thousand?
All right, Google is generous. I'm sure they have a purpose,
Mufti Google.
an ulterior motive for being so generous.
Actually, I do have a quick question. Because when you get into matters of faith, you can find common ground. This morning we've heard the spirituality of St. John of the Cross. We've had also in Dr. Helene Egnell's presentation talking about it from the Christian point of view of, not familiar with the new influx, the other. But it's not, so you can find common ground on religious matters. It's culture, isn't it? That culture, that people eat differently, they dress differently. Aren't those as critical issues to address as religious?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Shall I take the mic back?
Yeah.
I'll rob you of the mic. I'm very generous, but not for long. Yes, I would say that, what is religion, what is culture? It is extremely difficult to separate. I used to say that when I became Muslim and became confronted with Muslim cultures, it was a task for me to separate out what is religion and what is culture. But today I don't think so anymore, because I think you cannot have really, culture will always be part of religion, and religion will always be part of culture. So I think it's just part of the form, part of the shape. So I think, I think we should go beyond. We should move beyond, I think, really both religion and culture. Just accept these as these differences, these nuances that make life more interesting, and sort of move on to more important things. It's important, the intercultural, interreligious, and maybe you have other, inter-ethnic if you want, inter-language. You can go on for as long as you want. But because I really do not anymore ascribe to this thing that religion is good, culture is bad kind of thing. I believe it's all wonderful, really. And of course, it can be used for good, it can be used for bad. It has positive effects, and it can also have negative effects, but those are not really intrinsic either to culture or religion. They are the result of how we use and perceive culture and religion.
Any other questions?
I'm still not clued up on the program, so.
Well, according to the agenda I've got here, there's a feedback, questions and answers, and then Shaykh.
Oh, then Shaykh Fadhlalla. Yeah. So I jumped the gun then when I
Make sure that we
mic the Shaykh up.
Yunus, we should print some of the program for the weekend, so everybody can have them.
Then please put questions to everybody, or if anyone wants to say something. It shouldn't just be me and the.
No, questions to everyone, all the speakers.
Can you be the moderator, please?
Yeah, I'm the moderator, but there's no one putting their hands
Yes,
up.
there was.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
I'm teaching fundamental theology as one of the Catholic institutes. institution. And one of the difficulties about unity of religion, faith is very difficult. I want to ask, among the Muslim brothers and sisters, the tension between the Sunni and the Yes, how strong it is, because us, as Christians, we are the most divided, hopelessly. I don't think before we can talk with any religion, as long as we are highly divided as it is, I can't see how we could just even start to talk about going over there while we are back. In this country, we have about 4,000 different churches. No, but I want to know more about the Sunni.
Good.
And how much is the tension?
Shall I do Shaykh or?
Shall I take it? Or? So, I think, I mean, yes, because I do give a lot of lectures or courses on Islam and Muslims to people who are not from a Muslim background, who meet Muslims maybe in a professional, capacity, maybe as teachers or social workers, or in the church, etc. And it's a very common question, this thing about the Shia Sunni. I mean, yes, there is a sort of there is a tradition, a Sunni tradition. There is a Shia tradition, and there are tensions between them. But I think if you want to understand a Muslim, I don't think it's very helpful to know whether this is a Shia Muslim or a Sunni Muslim, because that's not really very important when it comes to understand how do you relate to your religion, because there are many different ways. I mean, for some people, religion is more about not breaking the rules, and to other people, it's about a toolbox to access the divinity. And to others, it's a political ideology, or to others, it's a social context. And these things are much more important than whether you happen to be a Shia or a Sunni. Having said that, there is it's our trauma, it's our inherited trauma as a Muslim community or a nation. No, I don't forget about nation. As a Muslim world community, it is a trauma that we have not yet been able to reconcile those events that sort of, right after the demise of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, really, that gave rise then to this controversy. Obviously, to a very large extent, increased by the martyrdom of Sayyidina Hussein. So it has got to history. It's history. It's part of our history, and it's because then it's been a tradition of maybe generally one of the other, usually the Sunnis, having had this sort of worldly power, and then the others having been, if not persecuted, then at least ostracized and sidelined by the powers that be. So Shia had turned out to be a little bit of the religion maybe of the oppressed, vis-a-vis the Sunni being the sort of state religion in many Muslim lands for many centuries. Not everywhere, not all the time, but usually. There are not only Shias and Sunnis, there are other directions as well, but the two largest ones by far are the Shia and Sunni. And you're right, and you really have a strong point there, that it can be difficult, but it can also be quite not so difficult and almost cozy sometimes to have inter-religious dialogue. But what is really, or interfaith dialogue, what is really difficult is the intra-faith dialogue, the intra-religious dialogue between, for example, Sunnis and Shias. And it is different. I mean, in some places we don't have any issues. I mean, I don't think we have any issues, do we, Shaykh Fadhlalla?
I have a tissue.
Oh, you have a tissue, right. That's fine. We may have tissues, but we don't have many issues relating to that. And in some places, they shoot each other. I mean, this guy will be riding the motorbike, the other guy sitting behind with an AK-47 or something similar, and going past the mosque after the Friday prayers and just going, and the next day the others will go to the other mosque. No. These are the good Muslims. I mean, I know it happened. I haven't seen it with my eyes, but I've been very near it happening among people who will be very upset and think that it is absolutely abhorrent that these guys should shoot our guys, but they don't realize the enormity of the whole thing. That what are we doing? They're just thinking of what are they doing to us, not what are we all doing to each other. So there is a lot to be done, absolutely, and there is a need. And maybe the inter-religious dialogue and meetings and work can actually be a way, a stepping stone towards the maybe even more important intra-religious dialogue and meeting, where we can realize that. I think maybe it's more difficult because it's closer to home. We're both so to speak, claiming the same truth. Whereas with different religion, it's more obvious to us that there are different. We can sort of deal with them because, well, it's them, it's not us. Which is, of course, also a very funny thing. I can carry on forever, so I'll stop there.
Can I please, forgive me if it's an awkward question, but I would like to ask Sheikh Fadhlalla, this meeting here was such an important piece of the puzzle since I'm a beginner. And I would like to, what I keep hearing is there is only one. And obviously there are different religions, but are religions really needed at all?
Nothing is needed. Not religion, no differentiation. It is all about differentiated sameness. But you have to be local. You were born somewhere, you had a mother. And you began to have differentiation of what you like, what you don't like as a child or as a growing up. So it's unavoidable that we have this intermediate thing called mind, which physically manifests as a brain, connects the absolute, the infinite, the universal, the cosmic, with the local and the limited. So you have a mind, I have a mind. We cannot survive without a mind, but we will never arrive with a mind. You cannot survive as a human being. There will be no humanity without a mind, but you will not bask in the infinite perfection of divinity with a mind. So our business, if there is such a thing, is to unify the two. Ibn Arabi says, قام الوجود كله ما بين ذم وثنى. Half of the stuff is desirable, attractive, power, wealth, knowledge, goodness, harmony, and the other half is the shadow of that. So arguments, if you like, disagreements, violence, all of them are the shadows that in themselves are abhorrent for humanity, because we are obsessed with survival. Our obsession is to live. Our obsession is with the life giver. All of us, whatever is alive, whether it's an ant or a mouse or a human, is obsessed with life. We'll kill for life. And life is from the life giver. So that is the prevalence of God. And that is the meaning of wherever you look is the light of God. So that means in truth, there is none other than that. Everything else are, if you like, distraction from the dot. Everything is in it, everything is from it, and everything returns back to it. Ibn Arabi's couplet continues, it says, Alhamdulillah alladhi adhhaba anna al-huzuna. First he says, the entire creation is balanced between good and bad, attraction, repulsion, yes, no, he, she, this religion, that religion, this place, that, hot, cold, etc., well, ill. And then he says, I'm expressing gratitude for that source that took away from me fear and sorrow. So all of the great religions try to share that. If you can get out of the zone of fear and sorrow, then you are really touching the dot in you, touching the light of lights in you. Otherwise, there will be differentiation, and you cannot deny them. You have to address them and have dialogue, have monologue, but after the monologue, you enter into the dot, and there is nothing to say. So there's said it all. In the meantime, you have to express yourself. The 7 major attributes are founded upon, which in Arabic says al-mutakallim, but you'll never be able to translate it or understand it. It is self-expression. Everything expresses itself. So you and I and the child and whoever and the birds, we have to be allowed to express. See? And the Quran also says everything that exists exudes itself, announces itself, and also loves what it does. So if you are within this religious box, you want to defend it because you belong. It's like your mother. You know, you have that connectedness. Whatever there is in existence emanates from absolute connectedness towards continuity, which is also timeless, back again to that origin. It's already done. What we have to do is to understand the basic map. I chose 4 short ayahs for you, for this interfaith and so on. One of them is يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها. O people, know, acknowledge, understand that we have all been created from one soul, from one blueprint, the Adamic blueprint. The rise of the whatever it is happened 50, 100,000, 200,000 years ago. So this is the Adamic arrival. This is the rise, if you like, of Adam. With that rise comes the fall. Also in most world religion, it says get out of paradise. Because with that rise of mind comes differentiation. In paradise there is no differentiation. You are like a baby in perfect situation. No good, no bad, no up, no down, no today, no tomorrow. Once that arises, the mind, you have to come into another womb, which is this earth. Nothing ever in existence is there without its double. Same way as there is the mother's womb, there is the earthly womb. And the earthly womb is space and time. All of us are in that womb, ready to be born out. That is death. That is why if you don't practice death now, the idea of death or the advent of death becomes a shock. And you don't like shocks. Nobody likes to be shocked unless it's a pleasant one. So for some people who are very sick, very ill, very distraught, whatever, death is a relief. So why not have it now? Relive. So all of us as human beings, we're being created from one blueprint. And then the other ayah, is number 213, surah number 2, Baqarah. People were one people, one nation, or one tribe, or one lot. But from amongst them, because they diverged, there arose people who had higher consciousness, so they gave them the good news, that there is only oneness. From oneness arises infinite dualities and two-ness. This is the good news. And if you are not on that ladder towards higher consciousness, then you suffer. And you are programmed not wanting to suffer. Nobody wants to suffer. Nobody wants to have bad news. Don't give me bad news. It's bad enough. So, unless you are on the ladder towards the higher consciousness, deeper consciousness, boundless consciousness, infinite consciousness, God consciousness, you will be sinking towards personal, minute, my church, my mosque, my this or my family. It never ends. You suffer because you are a cosmic light caught within the framework of space and time, which is limited. That's why you don't like limited. Ask any very wealthy person how much will be enough. They may give you a figure, but then they want to add more zeros. Nothing is enough. That is why this wonderful declaration that if it is truth you want, if it is Allah you want, it is Akbar. It is not big, it is Akbar. There is somebody here who's also called Akbar with us. Yes. So it is bigger. It's not big. It's endless. That's what we want. You also, even in human situation, would you love me forever? Timeless. Would you love me more than anything? Yes. And so this is who we are. We are spirits, souls, boundless, infinite, caught for a little while to differentiate until you have seen it all. Then, يا أيتها النفس المطمئنة, you have seen it all, ارجعي إلى ربك. Now you return back fully content. I've seen it all, I've done it all. Thank you very much. If I stay longer, if I leave now, it's the same for me. The Quran is full of that sameness. Even people in paradise. The Quran says, they say, those people in paradise who have seen it all or have been awakened to highest consciousness, they say, هذا ما أوتينا من قبل. We have already tasted all of this. We don't want this anymore. أتمم لنا نورنا. We only want pure light. We only want infinite light. We only want cosmic consciousness. We don't want consciousness of nice this, that. We have tasted that. We've tried all our life to do improvement of our dwelling, our relationship, our food, our health. It's boring. Where will it end? So the other ayah also reminds us, وَخَلَقْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ. All of us are from different background, different people, different nation, different language, different church, different mosque, different this. So as you come to know each other, mirroring. إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ. Those of you who are most in cautious awareness of the absolute are the ones who are fully alive. And that's what all of us want. But we have to do it. So if you are a teacher, good luck. Preacher, good luck. But also charity begins at home. If you are not doing it to yourself, then it just becomes verbal and work. And that is why most of the young people don't go to the mosque or to the church, or especially if they are uniformed or if they are formal. You know, they want freedom. Freedom of what? Of yourself. Ultimately, you want to be free of your own ego, your own nafs. But don't denounce the nafs. That was the only friend you knew as you were 2-year-old. Me. Unless, of course, you end up as a president of somewhere in the West, also continues me forever. So you begin with that me, and then when you are 14, 15, you get every now and then a punch or two. Says, who is the me? Everybody says it's me. So then you enter humanity. Now I have to be understanding, I have to be tolerant, I have to be accepting. Accepting is Islam. Accept. It's not submission, surrender. Surrender to who? I haven't seen God. He hasn't showed himself to me. Until you realize that there is only God. It isn't I and God. There is only that. So who are you? At best, a shadow. And that shadow is what is causing us all the trouble. But unless you address it, unless you are honest, 100%, you find that it is the shadow that showed you the light. So if you are wise in your 40s and 50s, you think that the ego was perfect. Because that's all what you knew as a 4-year-old, but now you also know that was your shaitan. It showed you that this causes you trouble. It's endless what it wants. And you want to be free of wants. You want to be liberated from ever-increasing desires. So ultimately you end up, if you are truly reflective and meditative, you will have one desire, and that is to have no desire. So you are in this world, not of this world. Then you have done it. Then if you live a bit longer, if you live a bit, you are celebrating the perfection of the cosmic truth of oneness. If you are doing that, then you are on the path of that, beyond all of this name and this mosque and this interfaith and entering this faith or leaving this faith. But you have to be honest also that the entire thing is evolutionary. The majority of people need help. The majority of people are suffering from excessive zealousness and warfare. But also don't ever enter into that fantasy that our times are more difficult than before. Not true. Our time is better than before, better than 10 years ago, far better than 100 years ago, far, far, far better than 1,000 years ago, much better than 20,000 years ago. So celebrate the moment that here you are from different parts, you manage to really hoodwink and enter into this atmospheric thing of riding a plane and coming here. I still don't believe it happens, but really there you are from different colors. We are all the same, but don't forget differentiated sameness. We all want that connectedness that has no beginning and no end. Truth has no beginning and no end. Allah has no beginning or no end. Beginning and the end are the same. Your beginning and your initial inception and your destiny are exactly in timelessness, is the same. So if you are ready for it now, good luck. Celebrate it. And then you have your own self-control. You've eaten enough, you have done enough, you have spoken enough or not. Then you are integrated. And you're celebrating being a human, celebrating that the air goes in, may not come out, celebrating that all aspects of solids, liquid, fires, matter, electrons, neurons are all in this universe of yours. Respect it and consider the others as exactly the same in potential. They are the same in potential, not the same as now. You're wealthier, you're more knowledgeable, you're healthier, but in potential, it is all the same. So you have true respect. You have no arrogance. You never know. Somebody whom you looked at, you thought he was a silly fellow, whatever, ignorant. He or she may save you your life or give you what. So don't ever underestimate the small. You and I and he and she are actually walking hotel for 3 or 4 kilos of viruses and bacteria. That's it. So you and I, maybe actually our main purpose is that to carry these bacteria around. So don't be a fantasy, arrogant and so on, and cover yourself with one of the biggest industries in the world, which is camouflaging your face and having this change and this. It's nice to look clean and good and attractive, but there is a limit to that. The rest becomes a lie upon lie upon lie. So camouflaging industry by words, by this elocution, by so be honest. The truth in you is an eternal light. The more you refer to that, the more frequently you refer to that light, the more you are calibrated. You are the same as any other human, and knowing inside of you that it is light upon light. But when it comes to talking, connecting, you need to be truly just and true democrat, regarding everybody else potentially the same. So we need to have that constant reminder that somebody else biologically they are different, racially they are different, educationally they are different, their culture is different. Then you find all of these differentiations are minor outer changes. Truth is ever there and it is the same and it has no change. The more frequently you calibrate, the healthier you are. In body, in matter, in mind, in heart, in spirit. And that's all each one of us want the same. So we are the same in wanting the same. And that sameness is presence. The presence is the same as eternity. If you enter into the moment totally, it's eternal. You don't anymore question how many years, how many. It is perpetual. So you and I and he or she have a perpetual reality, eternal, and have a human reality, birth and death. You have to celebrate the limitation and bask in the ecstasy of the boundless. That is why any gathering like this, when people have that orientation, is a good one. You know, because it shows that we are all intending the same thing, but leave back all of the different flavors and the colors and so. They're nice in an outer sense. Inwardly, it is light upon light upon light. That we have to celebrate. And the more there are people who are fully awakened to that truth, they are independent of how many people follow them or don't follow them. The more there are people like that, thousands of them, the more the evolutionary process of being ready to have that absolute cosmic oneness, which is the truth, the only truth, the more you have peace naturally. Otherwise, we are entering into a warfare because there is no peace. In the West, for the last 300-400 years, it is all about war against this, war against poverty, war against cancer, war. They were all warmongers. Look at the poor Scandinavians, until very recently. You know, the Norwegian has come there to the river, we have to shoot the others because they're having that. But look, they learned that they are the same people. So they began to trade cheese a bit from the north to the south, slightly different, or this or that. And look, so we need to enter into a new culture beyond war and peace. Presence, honesty, live the moment. And then it will be transmittive. It will be transformative. There is too much information, very little transformation. And that requires silence. Too much talk. Too many mosques, they will only create divisions. As soon as there is another mosque, there is a new mullah, so there is a different thing. Because the way he pronounced it is very different. And as was that great being said, he said he heard that take a black snake and mince it and let everybody drink from it. And they did that. And in Arabic it was, they made the mistake from, instead of one dot, so they took two dots. Habba soda. And he read Hayya soda. Hayya is a snake. Look, it's very simple. One little extra dot made everybody get poisoned by this snake. Watch out. What does it mean? Who is it for? What for? If it is not going to open the gateway to you of perpetual contentment and happiness, run away. If any teacher or any leader or any says me, I am the way to your city, run away. If they say it, I'm on the same path, then maybe. Watch out. The world has progressed a lot from charlatans, whether economical, whether it's pyramidal schemes or religious. Enough is enough. Religion has served great purpose in the past. From now on is going to appearing to be more and more a handicap. It was a wonderful glue for communities and societies. It was a wonderful bonding. But now it's become a ceremonial. If you watch even this mosque, one of the best, occasionally I've watched people coming, they are shuffling. They're not coming in order to have a celebration. We have to go to the mosque because they want to get back to their shop. Because their God is, as Ibn Arabi said, and that's why they discarded him, he put his foot on the entrance to the Umayyad mosque in Damascus. It was a Jum'ah. And he told them, he said, the God you worship is under my foot. If he has not been married to the Mufti of Damascus' daughter, they would have slaughtered him. So they discarded him. Eventually, his grave ended up in the middle of the garbage area of Damascus. Nobody could find his grave until Sultan Selim, who had the notion, he was a Sufi oriented. He read, La yadkhul, until Qabru Muhyiddin, they didn't know where his grave was. La yu'rafu Qabru Muhyiddin hatta yadkhulu Sinu fi Shin, until the S enters the Ish, until Sultan Selim enters Sham. So when he arrived in Sham, it was on a Friday that he decided, today I'm going to call all the mullahs. There were maybe 1,200, 1,300 mosques. He said, you all come at midday to be with me, and you'll have a golden coin. So all of them came. So they each got a golden coin. He said, now I tell you why Muhyiddin said, your God is under my foot. What I've given you is actually was a pot of gold under where he put his foot. And this coin you have is from that pot. These are who you people are. So watch out. People love money. It's not money, it's power. It's not power, it is the love of the all-powerful in their heart. All of the other great attributes, the all-knower in their heart, the all, etc., etc., etc. So the great attributes of Allah is what we love. Because we love the truth. The truth is eternal. The truth is already, it's given you life. It's in you. But also it's reflected outwardly, including its opposite. Including, you were talking a lot about Rahman, but often Shaitan leads you to Rahman. Because it tells you, don't do it, don't come near me, I'll burn you. So he is a deterrent. It is the shadow and the fear that takes you to the light and the ever-present there. That's all what it is, Baba. We are all the same. But you must also be honest to where you are. You need more studies, more reflection, more time, less food, more fasting. You need to do it. Be with people who are trying the same thing, and you will get finer and finer in your recipe until you then really read the Quran in its transmittive way. When it says on the Prophet Nuh, he says, it is he who created me, الذي خلقني فهو يهدين, and it is he who will guide me. And it is he who I know will give me what I need to do as remedies. Yushfin, he will give me shifa. This is a very high level of total trust. You see? So you need to develop trust through not trusting. You need to develop all of the higher attributes through the lower. You need to start with mistrust. You need to start with confusion, and then you end up with fusion. If you start with fusion, I know it all, you know nothing. Remain as human at that level. And then the light in you, which is beyond humanity, beyond it all, will give you every now and then what is needed by its evaluation of you, not you. So you don't become this, as the Quran says, like a donkey carrying all the encyclopedias on it. You trust because you know what you need to be given, you will be given to you at that time. So you don't carry it anymore. I don't know anything. But I know what I need to know will be given to me at the time that it knows my need to know. Not your idea. Because you are cumulative. You want more. ألهاكم التكاثر. Nothing will be enough. So laugh at yourself. Enjoy the ego. And bask in the joy of that light which is cosmic. Differentiate is sameness. Good luck to you all. I'm delighted to be here with you. And I can also assure you that Allah's truth says, take one step, I take 10. And it's been happening here in our little. Every time we took one little step, better came, more. Because the intention was genuine. The intention was for Allah, by Allah. And sometimes you may not be in the right place, you have to run away. But I assure you, this place and these people here are as good as you can ever come. And enjoy it. Appreciate the differences and celebrate the eternal oneness. And then you'll find that you have to have difference. This moment is not the same as it was 2 hours ago. Today is not the same as yesterday. Today's human warfare and nations is not the same as it was 100 years ago. It was much worse then. Celebrate the goodness and see there is a cumulative goodness if you go for the facts. But then you realize also each one of us is responsible towards your own self, your own immediate people. Do what you can and no more. I have one motto. Do your best and trust in the rest. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Wow. Those were real boulders. The sound of what he said will reverberate for many, many moons to come if we really ponder over what Shaykh has said. One or two questions we'll allow, and then we'll close. Okay, yeah.
Probably they're intelligent people, they have got everything answered. No, bismillah, whatever you decide.
Okay,
I follow you.
all right. Abu Bakr,
Sheikh Fadhlalla, you very much answered my question, but I'd like to have a little bit more clarity about the doctrine of Insan al-Kamil, which I
Historical, Baba. You people are still looking at the back. You're still going for more degrees in Islamic studies. Go somewhere else. These were, I shared with you something very intimate. I was immensely taken by Shabistari and few other people like that, including also Geely of Insan al-Kamil. And then I had Shabistari about, I was going to redo Gulshan al-Raz because I'd never found a good enough translation. Because there are, in every line or two there is a word that you translated, but it has got an entire garden in it. And then I collected maybe 9 or 10 huge, voluminous commentaries on Gulshan al-Raz. Gulshan al-Raz is a very small production. Maybe in A4 it will be not even 100 pages. But huge number of traditional big volumes, 100, 600, 700, 800 pages, 1,000. I collected them all. After 6, 7 years of reading them, they were in Persian and Arabic. I had a dream of Shabistari laughing at me. He said, "You idiot. We did what we did in our time, and this was there because they were Gulshan al-Raz's questions and answers." He says, "You are of a different age, different time. The issue is the same. The issue for you to get out of your tissue." So, but times changes, culture changes, needs changes. So live your time. Then for years, maybe no less than 9 years, whenever I was confronted with do this or that, I had these dozen people. I look at their faces, and Shabistari was one of them, and Geely was one of them. Imam Ali was another. I just scan quickly about their faces. If I see all of it smiling or correct, then I do, this is fine. If not, I don't want to suffer, so I don't want to do it. So I had so many of these people, including Geely, saying the same thing. Oh, don't live our time, you can't, but take the meaning of it. So Insan al-Kamil, at those days, it had a meaning. It had in it a cultural, if you like, place, which means complete your journey. But it's not a perfect man or the perfect being. There is no such thing. There is only perfection in the cosmic truth, in the light. But you and I are struggling for that perfection. So if you're truly struggling with total dependence on it, with willingness to give up everything, your life included, then you are on the ladder towards perfection. So you are, by that, if you like, old-fashioned courtesy, you are considered, he is a person who's trying to perfect his presence, his journey, his reality. So otherwise it becomes misleading. It becomes Islamic studies, is good for a PhD, which leads to 10 more PhDs, and it is boring. It leads to nowhere. That is why I think anything to do with spirituality or all that, you can only go about historical events or some differentiations or get a degree and get out. Otherwise, it won't work. You are as good as the knowledge that the so-called you does not exist. And the real you is only a spark of the same light that is everywhere. Thank you.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. One more question before we close.
What's for lunch?
Break for lunch.
I said, what's for lunch?
Oh, the most important question. Bismillah, be honest, be real, otherwise it's endless. Questions and answers, all of that is important as a basic level. The young ones need to be answered, they need to be, and many a time also, you will find yourself say, please reserve this question for later. You know, come back in 20 years' time, 10 years' time, whatever it is, or really, and it will be answered, time will answer it. At the end, you find all of that was lower skirmishes of the duality of yourself. That's all.
I don't know if it's a question, but when our sister here from England was talking about nada, when you were talking about the nada, the emptying out, because in yoga as well, we have like the yoga of nada, and that's also that emptying out. So I was just kind of like very interested to hear.
The most important thing is lunch. They're missing the point.
I'll tell her to discuss it offline.
Yeah, I didn't know that there was another version, so I'd like to know.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think from John of the Cross, we're speaking about.
Can you take it over lunch?
Oh,
maybe,
sorry.
or would you want to come and say it here? Because can I put the mic so you can hear? We want it on the recording.
Come and sit here.
No, Sheikh.
Let's sit. Baba, sit here.
Sheikh.
Here, I said we have
You sit
place.
there, Sheikh.
That's where the bill is paid.
Everybody
Everybody
wants
bill is paid. The businessman, he knows whoever sits here have to pay the bill.
In a way, I think Sheikh Fadhlalla has said it all in a different way. For John of the Cross, with all his progression to divinity. Sorry, my voice must get louder. I think in the last analysis, it's precisely this emptiness, complete emptiness, particularly of all the doctrines and the experiences and all the thoughts. And when he comes to the end of his life, and it's just the spiration of the spirit, it's a realization, actually very much along, you could answer what you're just saying. There is no I, it's an apparent I, the ego. The reality is, as he said in The Living Flame of Love, the spirit breathing, the spiration of the spirit. And I think personally from our own experience, and I speak for myself, it's a question of letting go, particularly of all the thoughts. And it's not easy to let go of thoughts because that's the nature of the mind. But he teaches us that we can go beyond all of that into emptiness. And I guess from the yoga perspective, it also has to do with the mind as well. And then there's the realization of the todo. There's only the todo. There's only the divine. There's only that reality. There's a contemporary spiritual speaker or master called Tony Parsons, English. I don't know if you come across him. He's not terribly inspiring, but he keeps giving the same message. When anybody asks him a question, he'll say, but there is no I, there is no I. And then everyone goes silent again. But in terms of trying to intellectually understand it, I don't think we can. But it's a mystical realization of the oneness, in Sheikh Fadhlalla's words, but of the reality. So in the end, we don't have to do anything. We don't have to do anything. Well, we do have to carry on just living a bit more, but in terms of future planning and everything, it's all here and now. So it's a complete nothingness, emptiness. As
So that just goes to show, doesn't it?
Can we take this offline now? Because I think we already at overtime, +1.
sure.
So any questions you want to ask, please take it offline. I'd like to thank you all for being present here this morning, and I want to thank all the speakers for really contributing to this great event. And I must thank Sheikh for concluding this meeting with a very dynamic and powerful speech. And sister and brother Muslim, all of you, thank you very much. Allah be with you. Assalamu alaikum. Just